August 1945. The air over Tokyo still carried the smell of ash. Entire neighborhoods were little more than twisted beams and broken roof tiles. Yet amid the ruins, a new kind of silence had taken hold. Not the silence of surrender, but of uncertainty. Inside a commandeered government building near Hibiya Park, a group of Japanese women in faded khaki uniforms sat stiffly at wooden tables. They had been officers once, clerks, nurses, translators, and administrators in the service of the Imperial Army. Now stripped of insignia, they waited to learn what fate awaited them under the occupying forces of a nation they had once been told was the enemy. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor. When the American officers entered, the women stood instinctively, eyes cast downward, hands at their sides. But instead of orders came a question, simple, direct, and incomprehensible in its intent. "What do you think?" the American woman in uniform asked them, her tone calm, respectful. For a moment, no one moved. The women exchanged uncertain glances, unsure if it was a test, a trick, or a mistake. No officer, certainly no man, had ever asked for their opinions before. That single question marked the beginning of something they had never imagined. A confrontation not of armies, but of ideas. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, an entire empire collapsed overnight. The voice of Emperor Hirohito, once considered divine, echoed across the nation through crackling radios, his calm tone masking the shattering of centuries-old beliefs. For millions of Japanese, the war's end was not victory or relief, but humiliation and confusion. The homeland lay in ruins. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that once glowed with life, had been reduced to ashes under relentless American firebombing. The many groups that faced an uncertain future were the women who had served in Japan's vast wartime bureaucracy and auxiliary corps. Known collectively as Josei Shokuin, or female military staff, they had filled crucial administrative roles: typists, communications clerks, nurses, and logistics officers. Though far from the front lines, their work kept the machinery of war functioning. Some had coordinated medical supplies for the wounded returning from China and Burma. Others had recorded casualty lists for families who would never see their sons again. Their loyalty to the emperor was absolute, their discipline unwavering, and in return their voices were silent. Before 1945, women in Japan lived under a strict social code defined by Ryosei Kenbo: good wife, wise mother. It was not merely a phrase, but a national ideal. A woman's worth was measured by obedience, modesty, and sacrifice for her family and nation. Education emphasized morality over intellect, and public opinion punished ambition. Even for those in uniform, duty was service, not leadership. When Japan entered total war, this ideology hardened further. Female nurses and auxiliaries were expected to embody purity, endurance, and silence, extensions of the male command structure, never participants in decision-making. Then came defeat. When American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, landed to oversee Japan's occupation, they encountered a population paralyzed by shock. The Imperial Army had disintegrated, and its officers, men and women alike, were detained for questioning. Yet unlike Germany, where denazification took a rigid, punitive form, the U.S. occupation of Japan unfolded differently. It sought not only to demilitarize but to reconstruct society from within. The Americans saw the war not just as a failure of politics, but as a product of ideology, particularly Japan's rigid hierarchy and patriarchal control. In the early months of occupation, American officers began reorganizing Japanese institutions, from schools to local government offices. They established the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SICAP headquarters in Tokyo, where both male and female staff from the United States, military officers, educators, doctors, and civil administrators worked alongside Japanese personnel. For the first time, many Japanese encountered American women in uniform: secretaries, nurses, even officers who spoke decisively and freely. To the defeated, it was disorienting. To Japanese women officers, it was inconceivable. The women who had served in Japan's wartime ministries found themselves summoned by SCAP officials. Some were retained for translation, clerical assistance, or liaison work, essential bridges between the occupiers and the local bureaucracy. They entered offices where typewriters clicked in English, where American men and women worked side by side, and where hierarchy seemed flexible in a way that defied everything they had been taught. At first, there was only suspicion. American soldiers were supposed to be ruthless victors. Yet in those early meetings, something subtle but profound began to happen. The Americans asked questions, not commands, but questions. What did these women think of Japan's administration? How could things be improved? What was their perspective on rationing, on healthcare, on education? Many of the Japanese women officers didn't know how to respond. In their world, opinions were dangerous. During the war, expressing uncertainty about a military policy or voicing criticism of a superior could mean public shame, even imprisonment. They had learned to think silently and act without expression. Now faced with American officials who looked directly into their eyes and awaited an answer, they froze. This was not simply a cultural difference. It was an ideological collision, one between a society built on obedience and another that prized individuality. To the Americans, asking for input was natural, even courteous. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable that authority would seek counsel from subordinates, especially women. The Americans noticed the hesitation. Reports from early occupation observers described a visible struggle in the eyes of female staff, torn between fear and the realization that their words might actually matter. Many later recalled that the first few times they were asked their opinions, they replied only with cautious agreement, uncertain if honesty could be punished. But over time, a pattern began to emerge. Some of these women, particularly those who had worked as nurses or interpreters, slowly began to engage. Their answers, once whispered, became clearer. Meanwhile, the Americans were initiating sweeping reforms. Under the direction of MacArthur and his civilian staff, including feminist advisor B.T. Sirota Gordon, Japan's legal and political structures began to change. The Meiji Constitution was to be rewritten. For the first time in Japan's history, equality between men and women was to be enshrined in law. This was radical, almost unimaginable for those who had lived under the imperial system. Within this broader transformation, those small moments in the offices and classrooms of post-war Tokyo became symbolic. When a Japanese woman officer was asked, "What do you think?" it wasn't only about work. It was a challenge to a lifetime of silence. Some of the women later said they didn't fully understand what was happening at the time. They were grateful to have survived, relieved to have work, and curious about the Americans. But only later did they realize that they were witnessing the birth of something profound. Not just the reconstruction of a nation, but the awakening of a voice long suppressed. By 1946, this new spirit began to ripple through Japanese society. American-led education programs encouraged young women to speak in public discussions. Newspapers began publishing articles by female journalists. Women were invited into local councils and community organizations, and in 1947, a new constitution granted them the right to vote and participate in government. But in 1945, in that smoke-stained office where it began, none of them could have imagined such a future. The question that started it all, "What do you think?" still echoed in their minds, fragile but liberating. The transformation had begun not with power but with listening. And that moment, a single act of respect, would slowly unravel generations of submission. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the defeated empire became a laboratory of transformation. The American occupation was not just a military presence. It was a social experiment in rebuilding a civilization from the ashes of ideology. For the Japanese women who had once worn uniforms, their world became a collision of contrasts: silence meeting speech, submission meeting equality. Inside the restructured ministries of Tokyo, female clerks and officers worked beside American personnel. Some had been trained in calligraphy and etiquette, others in field nursing or wartime communications. They were accustomed to the stiff discipline of the imperial system, where posture was perfection and tone carried the weight of loyalty. Now, in rooms filled with cigarette smoke and English chatter, they saw something new. American women laughing with male officers, disagreeing openly in meetings, addressing superiors by name. To Japanese eyes, it bordered on rebellion. To the Americans, it was ordinary life. One recalled later that her first shock was not the occupation itself, but the sight of an American woman captain arguing with a male officer over supply distribution. and winning. For someone who had grown up under the strict hierarchy of Meiji and Taisho values, such a sight was nothing short of revolutionary. Women in Japan were expected to be quiet, graceful, deferential. Yet here were women who carried authority like a second skin. The Americans were not blind to this reaction. They understood that the most effective way to reshape Japan was not through punishment, but through example. SCAP's Civil Information and Education section began integrating Japanese women into roles that allowed them to observe democratic workplaces firsthand. Former clerks from military offices were assigned to administrative posts within occupation bureaus. Some assisted in the Red Cross, others in re-education programs for schools and local government. They were told to write reports, attend meetings, and occasionally, to their disbelief, speak their minds. For the Americans, asking opinions was procedural. For the Japanese, it was radical empathy. In one of the first mixed staff meetings recorded in late 1945, an American officer asked a Japanese woman administrator how to improve communication between local hospitals and supply units. Witnesses noted that she froze, bowed slightly, and replied that she would consult the superior officer. The American gently insisted, "No, I'm asking you." The room fell silent. That insistence, polite but unwavering, left a deeper mark than any command could have. It was in these small exchanges that the real battle of the occupation was fought, not between armies, but between values. The Americans sought to dismantle the roots of authoritarianism by introducing participation and equality at the most human level. Yet for many Japanese, especially women, this change created disorientation rather than liberation. Centuries of social conditioning did not fade overnight. Even so, curiosity began to replace fear. The Japanese women noticed that the Americans encouraged questions, praised initiative, and showed little interest in traditional formalities. They watched with quiet fascination as American men and women shared coffee breaks, exchanged jokes, and even criticized policy in front of superiors. To them it seemed almost anarchic, yet it worked. Decisions were made faster, discussions more open. The women began to wonder if this new system could exist without collapsing into chaos. Cultural misunderstanding ran both ways. Some Americans interpreted Japanese reserve as indifference or subservience, failing to recognize it as respect. Others, more observant, saw in that silence the scars of hierarchy. Reports from SCAP sociologists noted that Japanese women, when asked for opinions, hesitate not from ignorance but from the memory of consequence. The war had taught them that obedience was survival. Still, change seeped through the cracks. Language classes introduced by SCAP provided not only English lessons but exposure to new ideas: democracy, rights, equality. American female officers held informal discussions about health, education, and family. At first, the Japanese women listened silently. Then cautiously, they began to ask questions of their own, about voting, about jobs, about the strange notion that a woman could refuse an arranged marriage. To the Americans, these were ordinary conversations. To the Japanese, they were revelations. Some of the most profound shifts occurred in the medical field. Former Japanese army nurses, now working under American military doctors, were shocked by the level of collaboration expected from them. In the imperial hospitals, a nurse's role had been strictly defined: to follow orders, maintain silence, and defer to the doctor's judgment. But American surgeons encouraged their input, asking for assessments, seeking feedback during operations. For women trained to see authority as unquestionable, this invitation to participate felt almost transgressive. A former nurse from Yokohama later recalled, "The first time an American doctor asked me, 'What would you recommend?' I did not answer. I thought it must be a test. In our world, the doctor commands, the nurse obeys. I only understood months later. They truly wanted to know what I thought." In offices, similar awakenings occurred. Japanese women clerks began taking initiative in record-keeping, logistics, and correspondence. Their accuracy and diligence impressed their American counterparts, who often commented on their precision. Soon some of these women were promoted to supervisory roles within mixed staff units, positions that, before the war, would have been unthinkable. Meanwhile, in the wider society, American media, magazines, posters, and newsreels introduced the image of confident working women, Japanese newspapers under SCAP guidance began publishing stories about female professionals, artists, and educators. For young women emerging from the devastation of war, these stories were like faint beacons in the fog. But the transformation was not without tension. Traditionalists within Japan viewed this sudden equality as moral decay, an erosion of order that had held society together. Many families resisted the idea of women speaking freely, working alongside men, or engaging in political discussion. The older generation saw in the Americans' behavior a kind of arrogance, mistaking empathy for intrusion. The women caught between these worlds, between silence and speech, often struggled with guilt. To voice an opinion felt like betrayal of everything they had been taught to respect. Yet the Americans' insistence on listening made it harder to remain invisible. Slowly within these women a quiet revolution began, not loud or ideological, but internal. One report from a 1946 women's education program described it best. At first they did not speak. Then they whispered. Then one by one they began to raise their hands. Each time an American asked for their opinion, it reinforced an idea that had never existed before, that thought itself had value, even from those without power. By the end of 1946, something extraordinary had begun to happen. The same women who once bowed wordlessly before male officers now organized meetings, coordinated relief projects, and debated policies with American supervisors. Their tone still carried politeness, but beneath it was something new: confidence. And this awakening was not isolated. It mirrored the wider transformation taking place across Japan. Women were entering universities, forming advocacy groups, and even running for office. The old imperial silence was cracking, and in its place a fragile but growing voice emerged. The Americans did not see themselves as liberators. Most were simply doing their jobs, enforcing the policies set by SCAP. But for the Japanese women who lived through those days, it felt like witnessing the birth of an entirely new world, one where respect was not granted by rank, but by recognition. The question that had once startled them, "What do you think?" now became a habit of thought. It was no longer foreign. It was theirs. From these subtle beginnings, the transformation moved toward something larger, a decisive turning point where Japanese women would not just answer questions, but begin asking them. By 1947, the transformation that had begun quietly in the offices of Occupation Tokyo had grown into something visible, irreversible, and profoundly human. The Japanese women who once hesitated to speak now found themselves standing at the center of a new kind of Japan, one reshaped not by generals or emperors, but by voices that had once been silent. It began with participation. Under the supervision of SCAP, Japan held its first post-war general election in April 1946, and for the first time in history, women could vote. Over 13 million newly enfranchised Japanese women lined up at polling stations across the country. Many still wore modest kimonos or worn work uniforms, their faces weary from years of hardship. Yet as they stepped into voting booths, holding ballots printed with unfamiliar names, they carried something far greater than paper. They carried the weight of generations denied a choice. 79 women ran for office that year, and 39 were elected to Japan's House of Representatives. Among them were former teachers, nurses, social workers, and widows of fallen soldiers, ordinary women now standing on parliamentary floors once reserved for the elite. For the female officers and clerks who had worked alongside Americans during the occupation, the message was unmistakable: the silence had been broken. In Tokyo's government ministries, that same spirit began to spread. Japanese women working as administrative aides and translators under American supervision were now trusted to lead small teams. They were asked to conduct interviews, file reports, and draft recommendations, tasks that once belonged exclusively to men. For the first time, they found that their thoughts could alter outcomes. One such moment occurred in the Ministry of Health, where former military nurses now helped rebuild Japan's shattered hospital system. When an American colonel overseeing operations proposed a new structure for distributing medical supplies, a Japanese woman, previously a lieutenant nurse in the Imperial Army, raised her hand. Her suggestion was modest: to prioritize rural clinics where epidemics still raged. The colonel paused, then nodded, adopting her plan. That exchange was recorded in occupation reports not because it was dramatic, but because it was emblematic. A woman who had once followed orders without question had changed policy, with a single sentence. Outside the ministries, similar changes echoed across Japan's civic life. American educators, led by Beate Sirota Gordon, the young woman who helped draft Japan's new constitution, worked directly with local teachers to redesign the curriculum. For the first time, textbooks included lessons on equality, human rights, and civic responsibility. Female teachers, once forbidden from addressing male students as equals, now led classrooms in discussions about democracy. They encouraged their students, boys and girls alike, to question, to reason, to think. In villages and towns still scarred by war, women formed community groups to help rebuild homes, feed orphans, and provide medical aid. These grassroots organizations became the backbone of Japan's post-war recovery. American officials often described them as the Quiet Revolution, a movement of women who did not march or shout, but acted. Many of these women were the same ones who had once served in auxiliary military units. Their discipline, forged in war, now found a new purpose in peace, and within this growing sense of equality, small gestures carried immense symbolic weight. American women officers, aware of the cultural chasm between them and their Japanese counterparts, began to use simple acts of solidarity, sharing cigarettes, exchanging photographs, or inviting them for coffee. In one recorded instance, an American sergeant presented a Japanese clerk with a small notebook saying, "Write your thoughts, they matter." To the woman, it was not a trinket. It was permission. By now, the question that had once unsettled them, "What do you think?" had become the foundation of their new identity. The women who had once sat in silence began organizing discussion groups, drafting petitions, and even challenging traditional workplace hierarchies. In 1947, one such group within the Ministry of Welfare presented a proposal advocating equal pay for women in government service, a demand unheard of in pre-war Japan. Though it would take decades to realize fully, the seed was planted. Meanwhile, in the constitutional debates of 1946-47, the voices of Japanese women found their most powerful echo. Article 14 of the new Japanese Constitution declared equality under the law regardless of gender, while Article 24 redefined marriage as a partnership based on mutual consent, a direct challenge to centuries of patriarchal family systems. Beate Sirota Gordon later recalled the astonishment of Japanese delegates when these clauses were read aloud. They had never imagined such words could exist in law, she said. For the former Japanese women officer and the clerks, nurses and typists who had first encountered American ideas in the occupation offices, this was the turning point. Many began to see themselves not as remnants of a lost empire, but as architects of a new nation. Their transformation was not loud or sudden, but steady and deeply personal. One woman, who had once served as an interpreter for the Imperial Army, later described the moment she realized the change within herself. During a discussion with an American officer, she disagreed, politely, firmly. "I expected anger," she said, but instead he smiled and said, "Good, tell me why." That was when I understood freedom. Such moments rippled through post-war Japan like quiet aftershocks. The fear of authority, once absolute, began to crumble. In its place grew an understanding that respect could exist without submission, that authority could coexist with equality. By 1948, women were teaching in universities, writing for newspapers, and holding government posts. For the Americans, it was a triumph of democratic reconstruction. For the Japanese, it was both liberation and reckoning. Some still felt guilt, believing they had betrayed traditional values. Others embraced the change with cautious pride. But none could deny that the world they had known before the war was gone. The most profound transformation, however, was internal. In interviews conducted years later, former Japanese women officers spoke not of politics, but of feeling human for the first time, of realizing their opinions, their words, their existence carried meaning. The Americans, many of whom returned home unaware of the impact they had left, had done something extraordinary without intending to. They had shown that equality begins not with ideology, but with acknowledgement. That acknowledgement in a single act of being asked, "What do you think?" had reshaped not only their work, but their sense of self. The silence of war had given way to the sound of conversation. And from that conversation, a new Japan was emerging, one where women would no longer wait to be asked, but would begin to speak first. The awakening was complete, but its consequences, cultural, emotional, and political, would echo for decades to come. By the late 1940s, Japan stood at a crossroads between memory and rebirth. The war's devastation was still visible everywhere: burnt-out cities, orphaned children, and lines of civilians trading belongings for food. Yet beneath this landscape of ruin, something more subtle but enduring was taking shape: a redefinition of what it meant to be Japanese, and within that, what it meant to be a woman. The female officers, clerks, and nurses who had survived the war and adapted to the occupation now carried within them both the trauma of defeat and the seed of transformation. Their world had been rebuilt on dialogue instead of orders, empathy instead of obedience. And as the occupation entered its later years, the impact of this silent revolution began to reveal itself in unmistakable ways. Within the administrative heart of Tokyo, the new Japan was being written, literally. The 1947 Constitution, drafted under SCAP's supervision, had come into effect, and its influence was spreading through every corner of national life. The inclusion of Article 24, guaranteeing equality in marriage, divorce, property, and family rights, was nothing short of revolutionary. It directly challenged the centuries-old II system, under which a family's patriarch held absolute authority. For Japanese women, it was as though an invisible wall had finally cracked open. But the transition from law to life was slow. Many of the former women officers, now working as civil servants or teachers, found themselves navigating a dual existence. In public, they participated in the new democratic institutions. At home, they were still expected to perform the quiet rituals of submission. Husbands, fathers, and brothers often resisted the change, and society itself struggled to reconcile modern ideals with deep-rooted traditions. Yet change persisted not through confrontation, but through persistence. Small acts of courage multiplied across thousands of lives. In one government ministry, a female administrator who had been among the first to be asked for her opinion by an American officer in 1945 was now leading her own department. She supervised both men and women, her authority accepted not because of foreign influence but because of competence proven over years. In local communities, women who had once been clerks or typists during the occupation became teachers, union organizers, and members of welfare councils. They taught the next generation to question, to think critically, and to see gender not as a boundary, but as a shared foundation of citizenship. The effects were especially visible in education. SCAP's post-war reforms had rewritten curricula to emphasize human rights and individual responsibility. Female teachers, many of whom had lived through the cultural awakening of the occupation, began introducing their students to democratic values through simple classroom discussions. In a school in Kanagawa, a teacher asked her students, "What is fairness?" For the first time in a Japanese classroom, children were encouraged to debate openly. It was a small gesture, but one born directly from the earlier transformation of their elders. From the day an American asked a Japanese woman, "What do you think?" Still, not all saw this change as progress. Conservative forces within Japan, including elements of the bureaucracy and the old aristocracy, quietly pushed back. They viewed the growing independence of women as an erosion of moral order, a Western infection that threatened the family structure. Newspapers debated whether American-style freedom would destroy Japanese femininity. In rural areas where tradition held tighter sway, many women continued to live much as they had before the war, their rights recognized by law, but restricted by custom. Yet even there, the slow ripple of equality was impossible to stop. By the early 1950s, when the American occupation formally ended, Japan had become a democracy not merely in structure but in consciousness. The press was freer, civic organizations flourished, and women's voices began to shape the national conversation. Among the most striking developments was the rise of female representation in government. Though small by Western standards, the number of women in public office tripled between 1947 and 1953. These women, many inspired by their early interactions with American counterparts, carried forward the ethos of inclusion. In 1952, as Japan regained its sovereignty under the San Francisco Peace Treaty, there was both pride and apprehension. The Americans departed, but their influence lingered like an afterimage. To many Japanese women, their departure felt symbolic, the moment to prove that equality could survive without occupation oversight. And for many it did. The post-war Constitution remained untouched, its gender equality clauses protected as sacred. For the former, female officers who had lived through every phase, from imperial, service to occupation collaboration to democratic reconstruction, the aftermath was deeply personal. Some wrote memoirs reflecting on how the war had crushed their bodies but awakened their minds. Others lived quietly, choosing not to speak of their pasts. Yet in interviews decades later, a shared sentiment emerged, that the Americans' willingness to treat them as equals had altered their perception of humanity itself. One former nurse described it in a single sentence that seemed to capture the spirit of her generation. "We were defeated as soldiers but discovered ourselves as people." Economically, Japan entered its period of rapid growth in the mid-1950s, and women once again became a critical part of the nation's labor force. Yet unlike before, they were no longer confined to silent administrative roles. Many now worked in offices, universities, and public institutions that recognized their merit. Their presence was quiet, but constant, an unspoken reminder that post-war Japan was built as much by women's endurance as by men's labor. Culturally, too, the transformation persisted. Literature, cinema, and journalism began exploring female perspectives with unprecedented honesty. Films like 24 Eyes and novels by female authors confronted wartime trauma and post-war identity, often portraying women as both witnesses and agents of history. These narratives echoed the real lives of those who had experienced the occupation, women who had learned, slowly and painfully, that their silence could become strength. Yet beneath the progress, contradictions endured. The ideal of the Ryosai Kenbo, the good wife, wise mother, did not disappear. It merely evolved. Many women balanced newfound freedoms with traditional expectations, navigating a delicate harmony between past and present. But perhaps that balance itself became Japan's quiet success, the ability to modernize without erasing its identity. The Americans who had initiated these changes often underestimated their impact. To them, the reforms were administrative, the policies procedural, but to those who lived them, they were nothing short of spiritual. The act of being asked for an opinion, once an alien experience and had grown into a national habit of discourse, reflection, and reform. By the 1960s, a new generation of Japanese women was entering universities, voting, writing, and leading, unafraid to speak, unafraid to disagree. They were the daughters of the silent officers who once bowed before American commanders, now carrying forward a voice that no empire could suppress again. The war had ended in ashes, but from those ashes rose something that no army could conquer, the idea of equality, not imposed but learned through respect. The women who once wept in silence now taught their children the language of participation, a language born not from victory, but from defeat, transformed into understanding. And as Japan stood tall again among the world's nations, that quiet transformation remained its most enduring triumph. History often remembers wars for their destruction, the battles, the losses, the flags raised in victory or surrender. But sometimes the most enduring victories are not marked on maps or monuments. They exist in the unseen transformations of human thought, in the way a question asked in kindness can reshape an entire culture. For the Japanese women who lived through defeat and occupation, equality did not come as a gift from their conquerors. It came as recognition, slow, hesitant, but genuine. The Americans who asked their opinions did not realize they were planting something more powerful than policy: dignity. In those moments of conversation, across desks cluttered with papers and typewriters, two civilizations met not as enemies, but as people learning how to listen. That act, listening, became Japan's quiet revolution. It reshaped homes, classrooms, hospitals, and institutions. It taught a generation that authority could coexist with compassion, that respect need not silence truth. In a nation that had once demanded unquestioning obedience, the simple idea that a woman's thought had value became a form of rebirth. Decades later, Japan would rise from its ruins to become one of the world's leading democracies, a nation defined not only by technology or industry, but by the stability of its civic life. Beneath that progress lay the legacy of those first hesitant voices, the women who dared to answer when asked, "What do you think?" In that question was the end of empire and the beginning of humanity. For those women, the memory of defeat would never fade, but neither would the memory of being seen. The war had taken everything from them, their security, their country, their certainty. Yet from that emptiness came a truth stronger than any ideology, that freedom begins not with power but with recognition. The occupation ended, the Americans went home, and the world moved on. But in the quiet rhythm of Japanese life, in classrooms where girls raised their hands, in offices where women signed their names beside men's, the echo of that first awakening still lingers. It is the sound of voices once forbidden to speak, learning at last to be heard.